Let's talk for a bit about how verb types can be grouped together. Although we've already learned 6 new verbs this lesson, we haven't had to learn a ton of new conjugations, relatively speaking, and that's because of the patterns that we've come to recognize. Grouping these verbs together makes it very easy to find conjugations. It's pretty easy to find a past tense form of decir, such as dijiste, when you know that it's going to rhyme with the equivalent past tense forms of hacer, such as hiciste. And suponer and poner are identical in every way except for the very beginning of the word. There's no reason to learn all of their conjugations separately. Now it's time for the best news yet. The rest of the verbs that we learn in this course through lesson 12 are regular verbs. That means that they all fit into one of 2 groups. We have verbs that end in AR or verbs that end in ER or IR. This means that instead of being grouped together in clumps of 2 or 3 like the irregular verbs were, all of these verbs are grouped together. If we learn how to conjugate just one AR verb and one ER/IR verb, we'll know how to conjugate hundreds and hundreds of more verbs because they'll all follow the exact same patterns. In short, the hard work is behind us. We're almost done learning complicated verb forms. Every new verb that we learn is going to be predictable. Let's just learn one verb of each type. To get to the regular verbs, we have to venture outside of this prime real estate near Joel's house, away from this little cluster of irregular verb shops that we've been looking at, and into realms that we haven't explored yet. If we go to the left, proceeding west, beyond decir, there's a very long street with shops on both sides of it along the enormous forest. This is where all of the AR verbs are stored. The first and most prominent shop that we encounter is the hablar shop. Hablar is a shop that's nestled nicely among the shade of some very tall trees. Hablar has sort of a monopoly over the entrance to the forest. It's the first thing we encounter, and all of the verb shops after this will meet the patterns set by hablar. Now, hablar is the word for speaking or talking. We saw previously that decir means to say, which is specifically what you're saying. The sir is very particular about what people say and reading meaning into everything that people say. But as with the English terms talking or speaking, the Spanish word hablar just references the fact that you're speaking or talking. It doesn't pertain to what's specifically being said. Hablar is a shop where Lar, the owner, gives speaking lessons. But unfortunately, his lessons are very boring. Most people who listen to him lecture basically hear blah, blah, blah. And he also teaches his students how to give very boring speeches. By his standards, it really doesn't matter what people say. As long as you're blowing out words, as he says, you're successful. So all of Lar's students just blow out words, like Lar does. The word hablar means to speak. You may be able to guess the present tense versions of this word. They're similar to patterns that we've seen before. Joel's word is hablo. The lizard's word is habla. The second person is hablas. And then the pandas have hablan. And then, of course, we have hablamos, for we speak. The stress syllable of most of these sounds like a, which is the first syllable of hablar. And the secondary syllable changes. Hablo, habla, hablas, hablan, and then hablamos. In Joel's case, he first says ah, and then he simply blows out words boringly, like his teacher Lar does. Hablo. The lizard says ah, and then he somehow manages to say blah, which is perhaps a slight improvement on his previous vocabulary, ra, although it's still very boring. The rest of the words simply follow the normal patterns, although notice that the first person plural, hablamos, has the stress on the second syllable, bla, instead of the first syllable, a. The verb hablar is most commonly followed by de, and then a topic. Talking about a topic would be hablar de a topic. You can also talk con a person. For example, we're talking with her is hablamos con ella. We're talking about that with our parents would be hablamos de eso con nuestros padres. Now let's go to the merchandise area of Hablar's shop. There's a window here, and the leaves from the forest outside are blowing into the room and hitting the lizard's face, interfering with its ability to try speaking. Instead of talking, the lizard starts simply blowing at the leaves to try to get them out of his face. The word for he spoke is habló. So think of the lizard blowing, and remember habló for the lizard. Meanwhile, Joel is extremely bored of Lars' nonsense, and he's often lulled to sleep by wind blowing through the leaves. So here he decides to lie down and take a nap while listening to the wind blowing. Joel's word is hablé, with the stressed syllable le. A blast of wind hits Lar as he's trying to speak, and he shouts, "Ah, blast it!" His word is hablaste, for you spoke. The pandas try to imitate Lar, but they simply say his name over and over. Lar, Lar. Their word is hablaron, for they spoke. The last and easiest word in this scene is the first person plural, because it's exactly the same as the present tense, hablamos. So remember that the present tense was hablo, habla, hablas, hablan, and hablamos. But the past tense is hablé, habló, hablaste, hablaron, and hablamos. Here are some examples. Today I talked with Miguel. That would be hoy hablé con Miguel. We can easily vary this sentence using different conjugations. Today they talked with Isabela. Hoy hablaron con Isabela. Today she talked about me. Hoy habló de mí. She spoke about him would be translated as habló de él. But if she spoke about how she loved him, we're basically joining two sentences together. That's she spoke and then she loved him. She spoke about that she loved him. In these cases, we always need a conjunction, and this is why it's very common to use de qué after hablar. So roughly, hablar de qué means to talk about how, and then you describe what you're talking about. For example, she talked about how she loved him a lot. That would be habló de que she loved him a lot, or habló de que lo quería mucho. Now let's learn the imperfect forms of hablar for we were speaking or he was speaking in the continuing past tense. These are actually very easy. The stressed syllable is always blah, because that's all that Lars says as he stands behind the counter. Blah, 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 blah. So we have hablaba, hablabas, hablaban, and hablábamos. For example, they were talking about that is hablaban de eso. Outside the front of hablar, everything is exactly as you would expect it to be for a regular verb. I will speak is hablaré. He, she, or it will speak is hablará. We will speak is just like Joel's version, hablaré, but with mos at the end. Hablaremos. And then you will speak and they will speak are just the lizard's version with the normal modifications. Hablarás and hablarán. For the subjunctive, everything is very much like the present tense, except that they're now in the woods, and Joel likes to lie down and take a nap behind the store. So the stressed syllable is a, as in habla, but the second syllable sounds like le instead of la. So hablé, hablen, and hables. For the group, the stress is on the le, hablemos. So basically, we're taking that second A at the end of the word and we're turning it into the letter E. Instead of habla, we have hablé. For example, don't talk to me would use a subjunctive for the second person, and that would be no me hables. Meanwhile, the lizard tries to take a nap on the moving sidewalk to the side of the store, indicating that the imperative is simply the same word as the lizard's present tense conjugation, habla. For example, talk with him. That would be habla con él. The unconjugated versions of hablar are exactly what you'd expect them to be. Talking in the gerund would be hablando. On the roof, hablado is the participle, meaning spoken. For example, you have spoken would be has hablado. Now make sure that you have all of the forms memorized solidly. If possible, make sure that you can fill out an entire verb chart by writing down all of the conjugations in each scene to make sure you have them correct. If you can get hablar correct, you can get hundreds of shops that will learn here in the woods correct as well. Now, of course, these shops in the woods are to the west of our neighborhood of irregular verbs. But if we go east instead, beyond estar and tener, we find something very different. Just to the east of the irregular verb shops is a long street that runs along the Yol beach. Something interesting about this street is that the shops on the left side are all in the dry sand, but the verbs on the right side are all close to the water, and sometimes they get wet, especially when the tide rises. The first verb shop that we encounter at the beach is run by a bear named Deber. As a quick note, you may have noticed that all of our verbs that have the stressed syllable ber in the infinitive are all different people. We had the big blind bear for haber, the sad postman for saber, and then the female bear for deber. She's the sister of these other two bears. Deber is a moneylender and a debt collector. The verb deber can literally be used to mean to owe something, but it's used a lot where English speakers would use words like should or must. Basically, deber is a verb that expresses strong obligation to do something. Deber is pretty strict, and going to her store is a very stressful experience. If you ever go there a second time, you can be sure that she'll harass you about any money that you owe until you pay it all back. The conjugations of deber are extremely easy to learn. We don't even need mnemonics for some of the normal present tense because they're so regular. So we have debe for the lizard, which means he or she must. Debes for the second person, you must. Deben for the pandas, they must. And Debo for Joel, I must. The first person plural is debemos for we must. To explain deber's meaning a little bit more thoroughly, here's a quick example of how it's used. As we've learned before, to say, I have to be here, we would say, tengo que estar aquí. But to make it stronger, we'd use, I must be here, or debo estar aquí. Now, how about the imperfect past tense? These are very easy. They all work the same way that tener, querer, and hacer did, with a stress on ia. So we have debía, debías, debían, and debíamos. Now let's go to the red area in the back and learn the preterite past tenses, which are a little bit harder to learn than the other tenses. Behind Deber's desk in the very back of the store, she hangs a few bees' stingers that used to belong to previous debtors. These were bees that owed her money but didn't pay it back. If anyone is slow to pay Deber her money back, she uses these stingers for persuasion. To say I owed or I needed in a preterite tense, the word is debí. So the stress is on B. Debí. All of the other persons here have the letter I in their preterites. The lizard's version is debió, which you might be able to see as a pattern that's consistent with dar, dio, or hablar, habló. But remember that letter I is in there. Debió. Then we have the pandas conjugation, which is debieron, and the second person is debiste, kind of like fuiste. The first person plural in the preterite is debimos. So it's like debí, which is Joel's conjugation, but with mos at the end. Debimos. In the backyard, the subjunctive tense is just like the present tense, except that the vowel is changed to the letter A. So instead of debe or debo, we have deba. Then we have debas, deban, and debamos. Here are some sentence examples. I must go to a different place. That would be debo ir a otro lugar. They must go to a different place would be deben ir a otro lugar. When debía, the continuing past tense, is used, we translate it into English as he had to or she had to, which would technically be tenía que, but it kind of puts a must in the past, which doesn't really translate. So debía ir would be she had to go. Debía ir a otro lugar. She had to go to another place. If you need an event, you would use the preterite. For example, you had to go to a different place, with having to go there as an event, might be debiste ir a otro lugar. Now, in all of these situations, we were thinking of deber as equivalent to must. So this indicates a very strong sense of obligation. But what if instead of saying he must do this, we wanted to say something slightly softer, like he should do this? In these cases, we still use deber, but we normally use the conditional version of the word. So that would be debería. For example, he should do this would be debería hacer esto. Here's another sentence example. You should come, please. Deberías venir, por favor. Using the conditional version of deber is especially true with negatives, because it's more polite to soften something like this. Instead of saying, you must not do this, it's more like saying, you should not do this. That would be, no deberías hacer esto. So now we've learned deber and hablar. Although that's only 2 verbs, these are our gateways to hundreds of more verbs. So you want to make sure that you really know every conjugation perfectly. If you do, you actually know the conjugations of pretty much all the Spanish verbs that there are.